Alright, so previously we covered the legends, data sorting, and the display units tab. In this video, we're going to be going through the primary and secondary y-axis. In the sample report, you already have a pre-configured variation where you can just play around, but for us, we're going to go through the training view and actually build one from scratch. So first things first, add an instance of the time series visual, quickly disable the background and the title because we're not going to be needing those. And as for the setup, we're going to add new date as our date field, and we're going to add payout as series 1, and we will add name as series 2. Now, for the name, we're also going to change the aggregation to be on count, and we're going to rename this field to be number of employees. There we go. Now, when we go into the formatting options, first things first, since we want to have two value axes, we need to enable the secondary y-axis, because by default, this is going to be disabled. Now, the second thing you need to do is scroll down, find Series 2, open up the Configuration tab for it, and keep scrolling down until you find Value Axis. Here, you change from primary to secondary. And now you can see these values are scaling more properly, because otherwise, the payout was in the millions, whereas the number of employees was only in the hundreds. So it didn't make a lot of sense to have them on the same value axis. Now, to customize this a bit more, we can also change the appearance for the secondary series. So we're going to transition it to be a line, and we're also going to adjust the thickness and add some markers for distinguished appearance. So there we go, markers, circle, we're set up. Now, going back to the primary and secondary y-axis, we're going to open up the secondary y-axis. The settings within these two are almost identical. The only difference between these two tabs is if we scroll to the bottom, right here, there's a setting called Align to the Primary Axis. So this is the only difference between the contents of primary and secondary y-axis. Now, going to the very beginning of it, let's go here. We can see that the first setting is the side. So by default, the primary axis is always going to be on the left-hand side, and whereas the secondary axis is always going to be on the right-hand side. But if you want it, you can also customize it. So you can even have both axes on the same side. It's not a typical use case, but hey, if you need it, you can achieve it. So we're going to put it back on the right-hand side. And another thing that I typically recommend is when you have a couple of series being assigned to each of the axes, do also customize the appearance of the secondary or the primary axis to help the user understand what values are being displayed on it. In this case, since we know that the secondary y-axis is going to showcase the number of employees, we're going to change the font color to the purple, and we're also going to add a title to it. So we're going to say number of employees. There we go. So this is going to help your users to quicker understand what values are displayed where. The only thing left is also change the title font color, so for a more cohesive experience. Now, as always, you can also adjust the font styling options. Like we already did, you can change the color, but you can also change the style, the family, and also the size of these fonts. Going forward, additional settings that you have here are regarding the zero line. By default, the zero line is always going to be visible, meaning that you will always have a 0 point on the value axis. The other two options that you have here are center, which is just physically going to place the secondary y-axis, in this case, in the middle of the chart. And the third option is floating. In this case, you can see there's not really much of a difference between visible and floating. That is because floating, what it does is it takes the minimum and maximum values within the visual, and essentially it allows you to start the y-axis from a different value. So for example, like 10 or 15. In this case, we're just going to go back to the visible because we always want to have a 0 point on the value axis. Afterwards, we have a toggle for the logarithmic scale. Once I enable this, you can see that the scaling model is changed from linear to logarithmic. By enabling this, you essentially also force the visual to always load the scale in a logarithmic type. Afterwards, you have your forced top and bottom values. Now that's something that you can use for those cases where you want to specifically distinguish the highest value that you have within the chart. Next is axis size. This allows you to customize the width of this primary or secondary y-axis. So for example, if I write something like 150, you can see there's a lot more white space right now. So it's something that you can play around to distinguish or create unique experience. Next one is going to be the value type. So by default, this is always going to be sitting on numeric. But if you also use, let's say, percentages instead of a numerical value, you can easily transition to something else. In this case, you can see since we're going with high numbers, it's multiplying everything by 100. So make sure that you're actually using decimal numbers when using the percentage scale. Now we're going to go back to the numeric. And the two additional settings afterwards are going to be display unit, which is something that you'll probably have already used. That allows you to enable the shortening for the value. So by default, it's on auto, but you can force it on something else if necessary. Then you have value decimals. If you have changed the value type to a percentage, you can see that instead of value decimals, you actually have percentage decimals. Now, that's just something to keep in mind if you have multiple values on both axes. Afterwards, you have your value affixes. Now, this is something we added to the visual to allow the users to further customize their y-axis. The reason for this is because it allows you to add a prefix or a suffix. So essentially, you can add things like kilograms per square meter, inches, and so forth to kind of better emphasize on what measurements are actually being displayed. Now, we can disable this for now. Afterwards, we have the scale adjustment tolerance. What this means is how much white space do you keep between the actual top of the chart and the y-axis. So in this case, if we can go and change this from 0.3 to 0.1, you can see the values went a little more up. It's just something also you have to keep in mind when you're playing around with two axes, because you don't want to have different scale adjustment tolerances on both axes. Otherwise, it's just going to create a misrepresentation of the information. Now, scale minimum step, self-explanatory. It allows you to define the minimum step between each gap in the y-axis. And then afterwards, if you really want to fine-tune, let's say, the min and max values, you can also enable custom value ranges and define the minimum value and the maximum value. Last but not least is going to be regarding the ticks. So right here on the secondary y-axis, you can see we have these small little gray ticks, identifying where the line is for that particular value. Now, if you don't need them, the easiest way to get rid of them is just lower the tick width to a 0. Alright, that's going to be it for the primary and secondary y-axis, and I'll see you in the next video.